Our opening words this morning come to us from L. Annie Forster. Let me tell you who we are. Spirit of ages, creator of life and love, whose names and attributes are infinite, knowable, and unknown. O Spirit, hear our prayers. Our names, too, are many. Let me tell you who we are. We are those who are innocent and those who are wise. We are those who are proud and those who are humble. We are those who are accepted and those who are shunned without understanding why. We are those who love life and those who are fearful and confused. We are those who know abundance and those who know scarcity. We are the inheritors of the past and architects of the future. We are givers and we are receivers. We are larger than our skins and smaller than our egos. We are diversity incarnate, dressed in all the glorious hues of ethnicity and all the fascinating textures of genetics. We are the harvests of creation, related by our humanity and separated only by our own voices. We seek a common language, a language of love. Ancient One, it is important to know us in our rich diversity, for we struggle to know ourselves and one another. Wise One, it is important to know us in our myriad similarities, for we are forgetful and need reminding. Dear One, it is important to know us in our many disguises, for we need but one thing. Help us to love, and help us to know we are worthy of love. In this, we are as one. Amen. Amen. Shalom and blessed be. Let us reflect for a few moments in silence. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that each individual is free to determine what is finally good and right and true, and that freedom carries with it the responsibility for each of us honestly and vigorously to seek out life's deeper meanings. So let us remind ourselves that our quest is neither trivial or inconsequential, but of primary concern if we are to live well and fully. Therefore, let us reflect on the ways in which each of us feels called upon to change and to grow. And let us resolve that in the days and weeks to come, we may live closer to that ideal. Let us reflect on the possibilities for our lives. So this is a two-parter. So today's sermon will get continued next month on the subject of national mythology, I suppose. Some of you may have noticed that popping up on your calendar was something called President's Day. President's Day is sort of celebrated in a variety of ways around the country. There's not really any consistent way. In New Mexico, it is actually the day after Thanksgiving. We're the only ones who do that. Some places it's Washington and Lincoln's birthday. And when I was a child, I remember celebrating, well, more or less observing George Washington's birthday. And I think that was mostly because we got a day off from school. But beyond that, I really don't remember the adults making that big of a deal about it. And it was always on George Washington's actual birthday, February 22nd. And actually in the early part of the 20th century, it was one of the bigger US holidays. It was right up there with Christmas and Thanksgiving and the 4th of July. And then there was also Abraham Lincoln's birthday. February 12th, which was also celebrated in many places, mostly in the North and the West. So I vaguely remember getting a few days off of school for that, depending on where we were living at the time. And I confess that I don't remember Washington's birthday becoming President's Day. I was in high school when it changed, and I was mostly interested in girls and music at the time, so, you know. But what happened was that the Uniform Monday Holiday Act of 1971. And so this law shifted the celebration of several federal holidays from specific dates to a series of predetermined Mondays. And that was so we could have more 3-day weekends, ostensibly for the nation's workers. Now, many thought that shifting holidays from these original dates would devalue their meaning, but the bill had widespread support from big business and labor unions and was seen as yet another way to boost retail sales, so it passed. Voila, 3-day weekends. So now we have President's Day, which is still officially Washington's birthday, even though it's meant to celebrate all US presidents living or dead. Now, color me cynical, but the only actual celebration I can find online is the George Washington Birthday Parade in Alexandria, Virginia. You can, however, get 1.9% financing for 60 months on a new Acura, 30% off of home items at Target, and get a great deal on a new laptop from Dell, Lenovo, and Hewlett-Packard. Dead presidents. Dead presidents is, or at least was, rap slang for cash money. And since our bills mostly have pictures of dead presidents on them, that really wasn't too much of a leap. Dead Presidents is also the title of a 1995 crime thriller, co-written by Michael Henry Brown and Albert and Allen Hughes, who also produced and directed the film. The story follows an African-American man, Anthony Curtis, as he returns to his Bronx home after a brutal tour of duty in Vietnam. And he and his friends can't find steady work, provide for their families in a country and economy that favors neither veterans nor people of color. And so in desperation, Anthony teams up with 4 friends to rob an armored car full of, you guessed it, dead presidents. Yeah. And of course, the robbery goes terribly wrong. 2 of the robbers die, as do 2 security guards and a police officer. And although the 3 surviving robbers make off with some of the money, their freedom is short-lived and they end up either dead or imprisoned. The underlying theme of the film is that of structural racism and structural economic inequality, which for people of color are pretty much the same thing. The legacy of dead presidents. And neither the film nor the legacy have a happy ending. We mythologize and remember Washington as the father of our country, that Lincoln freed the slaves, that Jefferson wrote the Constitution, all important things, and that there were a couple of Roosevelts and a Kennedy in there somewhere. But unless you're a historian, they're mostly forgotten men, and their picture on a bill has more significance. And a problem with all these dead presidents we've elevated as national figures is that while many of them did important things and have some noble characteristics, they've also done some pretty unsavory things and aren't regarded as heroes by many Americans. And there's plenty to find fault with. They were complicated and contradictory men. Washington owned slaves, although he freed them on his death. Jefferson and all the presidents up to and including Grant owned at least one slave. Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and most other presidents thought that Native Americans needed to be either totally eradicated or utterly assimilated. Unless we overlook the obvious, they're also all white and male. Products of a patriarchal society in which they wielded a great deal of power. And for those who pay attention to history, this is common knowledge, and I'm not here to rehash the blood and the genocide that this country was built on. But I am here to say that the stories a nation tells itself are important. And without some common story, some shared understanding of meaning and purpose, some shared identity, it's impossible for a nation to hold together. After World War II, the American story really began to fray at the edges and now is on the verge of unraveling completely. After the war, all the women who had worked in the factories and sacrificed on the home front balked at returning to their previous roles, and massive advertising campaigns sprang up to convince the nation that the future lay in traditional gender roles and the nuclear family. After the war, internal propaganda campaigns promoted the idea that America and the Allies had made the world safe for democracy, while ignoring the fact that democracy wasn't really being practiced at home. After the war, non-white veterans found their sacrifice was not equal to that of their white counterparts, while the myth of equality was promoted and the internment camps were completely ignored. A new enemy was invoked, communism, and the Cold War began, while the post-war economic boom floated all boats and spread American values and goods around the world. But with the exception of the Cold War, most of that lasted about a decade or so. The civil rights movement, which had been put on hold during the war, started up again, and it gained strength, as did the women's rights movement. Students saw that their country wasn't living up to its expressed values and began asking questions. And red, black, yellow, and brown voices began to speak out. Vietnam put an end to the idea that we were making the world safe for democracy, something that had become apparent earlier to much of the rest of the world. And since then, our national story has been deeply contested. Is our future one of dead presidents, of money and old myths, or something else? Nationalism is largely seen as something that belongs to the political right, something that moves to a jingoistic, patriotic drumbeat, a story of greatness that can do no wrong. It's muscular, it's expansionist, it's violent, and it's oppressive. And those criticisms hold a lot of truth. But there are many kinds of nationalism. There's ethnic nationalism, where a nation is defined in terms of its ethnicity. Economic nationalism, religious nationalism, racial nationalism, the ideology that advocates a racial definition of national identity. You can think of the Third Reich. And then there's anti-colonial nationalism, which came about during the decolonization of the post-war periods. Territorial nationalism describes a form of nationalism based on the belief that all inhabitants of a particular territory should share a common national identity. But that has turned out to frequently conflict with ethnic and linguistic and religious and cultural and other differences. And any of these can combine into different forms of nationalism. And the latest is the neo-nationalism sweeping the world. A nationalism marked by right-wing populism, anti-globalization, nativist sentiments, trade protectionism, opposition to immigration, opposition to Islam and Muslims, and calls to return to some idealized past greatness and cultural conformity. Nationalism has a bad reputation with liberals on the left because we associate it with the right. And there are many forms of nationalism that fit very well into right-wing politics and their ideas about the nature of people and society. It also has a bad reputation because our national mythology, much of it has turned out not to apply to women, people of color, those less economically fortunate, and a whole host of others. Because of that bad reputation, the left has tended to completely reject the very idea of nationalism. But when we do that, it leaves the right in control of the narrative, which is something we can no longer do. The ideals promoted by our national mythology still persist. Ideas of equality and fraternity, of opportunity and freedom. People come here from all over the world seeking the fulfillment of those ideals. People who already live here seek the fulfillment of those ideals, particularly those who have been denied them. So the question is there a form of nationalism that liberals and the left can support? I think so. It's called civic nationalism, sometimes known as liberal nationalism, although they're not completely identical. Civic nationalism is an inclusive form of nationalism based on traditional liberal ideals of freedom, tolerance, equality, and individual rights. Civic nationalism defines the nation as an association of people who identify themselves as belonging to that nation, who have equal and shared political rights and allegiance to common political processes. Civic nationhood is a political identity built around shared citizenship. A civic nation isn't defined by its language or its culture or race, but by its political institutions and principles, which its citizens pledge to uphold. Membership in the civic nation is open to anyone who shares these values, whatever your other characteristics. It also means that your religious, ethnic, cultural, class, or party identity is valued, but it is secondary to your primary political identity as a citizen. Because it is inclusive, civic nationalism is against bigotry, prejudice, and racism. It honors diversity. A foundational value is pluralism, which is the freedom to have a multifaceted identity, to add as many hyphens to who you are as you like, and still be an American. Sound familiar? There are many who hold that liberalism and nationalism are mutually incompatible. And the civic nation state is a rather recent invention, and one that has yet to stand the test of time. Prior to the 19th century, and still even today, people put their trust in cities, dynasties, feudal lords, religious groups, land, or ethnic identities. But without some shared sense of community, of shared national identity, It's hard to imagine a nation holding together, especially as diverse a country as ours. But nationalism has become a fact of life. And the struggle since our beginning has been what kind of a nation we will have. The human impulse to tribalism is ancient and it runs deep. Much of it is the result of our evolutionary history in small tribal groups. And our responses to nationalism are rarely rational, on both the left and the right. But even though we don't wrap ourselves in the flag, or see our history through rose-colored glasses, or blindly follow our leaders, we too have a claim to our nation and its ideals. Now, recreating a sense of community and common purpose is not as simple as just saying so or claiming the mandate of heaven. People weave story and ideal and experience into a national mythos. And not all of that is controllable by the powers that be, no matter what they think. And I'll return to that subject next month when I talk about Uncle Sam and the goddess. So I'll close today by returning to the subject of slang terms for cash. For a long time, slang for money had to do with references to its appearance, to food, or trading customs. Calling $1 a buck came about because deer skins were once a medium of exchange. A buckskin. A sawbuck, so a 10 in Roman numerals is an X, which looked like a sawhorse, ergo, a $10 bill is a sawbuck. A 20 was a Jackson, a 5 was a Lincoln, and a 100 was a Franklin. Our bills are green, so we got frogs, frog skins, green, guac, cabbage, broccoli. I've never used some of those myself, but they tell me that's true. A greenback was a Civil War term for Union currency. Money meant food, so cheese, cheddar, clams, bacon, bread, biscuits, bones, dough. And there's a certain rough vitality to all these terms. There's a liveliness, there's a sense of growth and nourishment, of personality. So until next time, I leave you to ponder what the term dead presidents tells us about the mythic state of our union. So back when there were kings and queens and princes and all that, we used to be subjects. And we became citizens. Somewhere along in there, they turned us into consumers, which I hate that word. It's so passive. So a citizen is someone who's active in their civic nation, which is what this nation has been from the beginning, even its own flawed form. So I think it's important, particularly now during this legislative session, and even every day, to be civically engaged. Because if we don't, we're passive consumers. We're being fed stuff. And that just won't do.